we need can a self know itself? Know itself, yes. The Buddhists would say certainly, and as I said, have to know itself. A self has to know oneself in order to be free of suffering and to achieve, one's fulfillment, one's awakening, and one's blossoming. Another meaning of Buddha, they say Vibuddha and Prabuddha. One of them is awakening, the other one is blossoming. Buddha means to blossom like a flower, like a lotus. And here, to understand that, we need the teaching, Nagarjuna's great teaching drawn from the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which is Buddha's own teaching in the Mahayana view. We need what's known as the teaching of the two realities, or sometimes people say the two truths, but better to say two realities, which is conventional and relative versus absolute or ultimate, those two realities. So when you say, can the self know the self, the relative self certainly knows, just as it's the relative self that doesn't know. Their relative self is trapped in suffering by thinking it's an ultimate or an absolute self. When the relative self explores itself and fails to find itself as an ultimate self, when that sense of an ultimate self dissolves under analysis, like the atom did, like the quark did, like the Higgs boson will in the future, then that is called the realization of selflessness or emptiness. And it is experienced at first as a kind of disappearance, where one sort of falls into or one penetrates into a kind of feeling of not being a body, not being, in a way, really not being a mind, because there's no content of the mind. So just vast space. One goes into what's called the space-like equipoised samadhi. And that is a very releasing type of experience. And there's a little danger that is then thought to be the great supreme self. But then when that itself is taken, when there's a momentum of inquiry, a momentum of analysis, of critical wisdom, prajnas, sort of knowing through, you could say, that then the person at first feels, released from being the self, and released from anything opposing the self, just a vastness. But then, that momentum what is this vastness? Then it becomes the target of the critical inquiry, and then it dissolves under analysis. So that's called the emptiness of emptiness. And when it dissolves under analysis, then you have what's called the dream-like aftermath samadhi, or the illusion-like aftermath samadhi, or I think the more polite and more joyful thing is to call it the magical aftermath samadhi, where the universe is perceived as magic, as illusory in the sense that still things seem to be intrinsically objective and intrinsically subjective, and I still feel like I'm really me and all this, but actually then I know I've seen it dissolve under analysis. So at first there's like an oscillation process, perhaps for some people, where they have that experience of freedom apart from things, which they kind of treasure and enjoy. Then annoyingly the things come back. But if they don't get trapped into thinking that disappearing experience was the absolute, if they don't get trapped in it, then they realize that experience is a kind of relative experience, the ultimate relative experience, but then it has to fuse slowly with the relative experience. And then the non-duality becomes, where wisdom and compassion become the same, is where the relative and the absolute, the relatively ultimate one, become one thing. And therefore one feels completely free, as if it was vast space, and yet one is there with others and totally then equal to the others. Because then this absoluteness of the self and the absoluteness of the other being different from the self have dissolved. And that's when one is enlightened. Non-dually speaking, that's when one is enlightened. The people who achieve, the people under dualistic Buddhism, who achieve that disappearing moment, they unfortunately tend to think they're enlightened by having done that. And then what they have is they lose a momentum when we're not introduced through the non-duality bodhisattva kind of teaching, but they're just the sort of arhat teaching. They think, I'm an arhat, I've conquered my enemy of the deluded self, and I've disappeared. And that's the freedom. But now there's a momentum of my body, and so I hang around with people, and usually they're nice. They don't usually become oppressive gurus in that case, because they're controlled by Buddhist monasticism and ethics and things, but they still feel superior to the other people. You can see in the Mahayana Sutras where Shariputra, who's the example of that enlightened arhat, he acts kind of high and mighty and really a little bit, but he's very nice and very kind. But he hasn't been introduced until he's, Buddha or Vimalakirti or someone gets after him, or the goddess Prajnaparamita gets after him in the Mahayana Sutras. He has introduced the idea that that state of disappearance, because it had a boundary, it occurred at a time. It was a product of meditative prowess and a certain critical wisdom, certain level of it. It's not an absolute in itself. It itself has no intrinsic reality. So nirvana is empty. There's an emptiness of nirvana as well. But that emptiness of nirvana is where nirvana comes together with the empty samsara, and then they both are there, and it's empty while being differentiated. Like Jeremy Russell said today, while being variation, informational variation in it, it's still empty at the same time. So, or in the terms of the wonderful Rupert, the screen and the image have fused actually completely. There's no separate screen, and there's no unchanging separate screen any longer. And that unchanging thing has become all the changing things. And that's a blissful time for that such a being. They can then bear being with all the beings. So, for example, they say in Buddhism, life, no more rebirth, as an end to the process of rebirth. I'm free, I've done what has to be done, no more rebirth for me. But what that means in the non-dual thing is no more involuntary rebirth, driven by blind passion, by anger, by wish for, by not under control by the delusion of being a separate being navigating through the universe. On the contrary, what there is a much vaster rebirth, what's called the Nirmanakaya of the Buddha, the emanation body of the Buddha, where Buddha manifests whatever kind of embodiment any different being needs to help them free themselves from their suffering. So in a way, Buddha is like mega, multi-rebirth, simultaneously in many embodiments, in theory. I'm always impatiently waiting for the Nirmanakaya to show up in the form of UN peacekeepers everywhere, and like overwhelm the warmongers and the people unnecessarily torturing and harming people, and the terrorists and either the individual or the state terrorists, either one. I'm always waiting for them to show up. So I'm not saying that I've met the Nirmana. I recognize the Nirmanakaya. I have difficulty doing that. I get very impatient with the suffering of the world. But in theory, enlightenment means omnipresence in the world, not disappearance from the world, in non-dual theory. And therefore in Vedanta, and this is where Shankara, as you probably know, was criticized badly by Ramanuja and Madhva, especially later Vedantins, because Shankara, by coming to Nirguna Brahman, to absolutely unqualified non-dual Brahman, totally relativized the caste system, the superiority of God, the superiority of the Brahmin caste. And therefore they kicked him out, actually, from Ramanuja, and they came up with Vishishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism. And even Madhva, in the 15th century, I think, or 16th, he came up with dualistic non-dualism, which was kind of fun. But when they kicked out Shankara, they said he's a crypto-Buddhist, a Prachana Bauddha. He's leading us toward Buddhism with its relativizing of all structures in the universe, and therefore taking responsibility. So then the Brahman has to take responsibility for the untouchable, the male for the female. There's no Purusha who gets apart from Prakriti any longer. Purusha Prakriti become Shiva Shakti, actually, and Shakti is usually the boss. In fact, if Shiva is smart, when he's smart,